Our time together today and tonight. One of the things I hope will happen is that tonight, that between dinner and when we go at each other's throats, that we'll be able to take a group photo. We did that 2 years ago. We did not get to do it last year. So I'm hoping we could do that, kind of get an updated picture. And if someone has a good camera phone, if we could use that as well, that would be wonderful. So if you could help me make that come to fruition, I appreciate that so much. Good to have Travis back home with us. I'm glad he had a safe trip, and we're looking forward to these next 3 weeks together. For most of the time in the history of mankind on the earth, men have believed that everything that we see around us came through creation. Now, they may have accredited that creation to some source or some fake god, but there is a predominant view over the history of mankind that everything came about through an intelligent designer, an intelligent creator. It is only in the span of time recently that men have come up with a second theory, a second belief as to how all of this came about. And I don't know about other countries, but I know in our country this has become more and more popular. Why is it that men believe that a theory, that mutations which are usually turn out bad, not profitable, not an asset for life, why is it that men find a view where eventually, after all of these bad mutations, one good one comes about? That, in other words, everything we see around us came about by chance and circumstance. Given enough time, one good thing happened, and then given enough time, another good thing happened. Why is it that men don't have a problem with that? Why is it men that feel that that type of theory is proven by science and that the majority opinion over the years is not? Well, it's because of this one word we're going to talk about today. That men really have not considered the evidence. Now, I'm not going to say that people of an evolutionary viewpoint can't point to things and say that's evidence. And that there is evidence that seems to say that theory has some truth to it. I'm not going to say that. There's some reality to that. But why is it that the other side can say that we have no proof and no evidence, and that what we believe is simply by blind faith? Well, it's because men really have not considered the evidence. God has brought about this argumentation as he talked to his disobedient children in Isaiah chapter 1, at the very beginning of the book of Isaiah. In chapter 1 and verse 2, God through Isaiah says to his people, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth. For the Lord has spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me." I want you to notice that this is a very common thing for God to do with the prophets. God, in essence, is bringing his people into a court of law. And here he calls, as we've been singing this morning, He calls his creation as the jury. Hear, O heavens, he says, and give ear, O earth. And here's the case he's making against his people. I've raised them. I have nourished them. I have given them everything a loving father can give. And how have they repaid me? They have rebelled against me, says God. In verse 3, he says, here's why. Take the ox. The ox knows its owner. In other words, the ox knows his owner. He is faithful to him. The donkey knows its master's crib. But Israel does not know. My people do not consider. Look at the New King James Version. God says the reason why they have rebelled, the reason why they've forgotten all the love that I've shown them is because they truly have not considered how magnificent what I've given them is. God says to his people, you need to consider the evidence. Jesus makes a very similar argumentation as he's talking about God's people in his day. And one of the things he says to them in Matthew 6, verse 25 is, do not be anxious, people of God. He says, for your life, don't be anxious for it. Don't be anxious as to what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor for your body as to what you shall put on. Well, first thing that Jesus says is you've got to have the right perspective. The right perspective, the right knowledge will take away that anxiety. And here's the right perspective. That life is more than physical food. And that the body is more than material clothing or even shelter that covers us. But how can someone come to that conclusion? Where's the evidence? And so as Jesus goes on in Matthew chapter 6, he basically says to his people, here's how you do that. You consider. Consider the birds of the air, that they do not toil, that they do not labor, and yet God takes care of them. They're not filled with anxiety as to where their next morsel of food will come from. Consider the lilies of the field, that not even Solomon clothed himself with the arraignment that God, the beautiful arraignment that God gives to the lilies of the field. He says, consider the grass. That's only here today, and tomorrow it is burned up. Consider the beauty of that grass. Though its existence is short, its beauty is grandeur. Consider the evidence, says Jesus. Let it lead you to the right conclusion. In Psalm chapter 8 and in verse 3 and 4, the psalmist writes, when I consider your heavens, God, when I consider the work of your fingers, and now here's some of the things he considered, the moon and the stars, which you have ordained. And so here's the psalmist that says, as I look at everything around me, everything that's exists in the world, first off, he gives the due credit to God. It's the work of God. His fingers, his hand brought it about. But here's what he does. It makes him ask this question. What is man that you take thought of him? And the Son of Man that you care for him? O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth, he says in verse 9. And so the picture we get here is the psalmist is looking at everything that is in existence in the world. And he feels so insignificant. He feels so small. He realizes he has this God that is so far above this world and so powerful beyond the might and the strength of mankind. He says, what is man in comparison to you and what you've done? And yet, as great as you are, You've made him just a little lower than the angels. You've cared for him, loved him. What gave him that message? It is giving proper abode to everything that we see around us. Paul says a very similar thing in the New Testament, Romans chapter 1, verse 20. He says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen." Can I emphasize that again? Have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Ultimately, as you try to teach the Bible to people, you'll have someone try to deny everything the Bible says. Salvation, baptism, faith, all of that. And the argument they'll use is, what about that group of people, that tribe out in the middle of nowhere that never has had a Bible, that never has come to be taught about God or Jesus Christ? What about that group of people? Well, my first thing would be is, I don't know if that really does exist. Is there a group of people that hasn't had the notion of a God, a creator, of even the Bible and Jesus Christ? The gospel has been taken all over the world, even to the remotest parts of the world. Even in our day, that concept has gone out to the deepest parts of the world. I don't know if that's a valid argument, but even if it was, Paul's word says they are without excuse. Not because someone didn't give them a Bible. Paul talks about the second revelation of God. The second revelation of God, which actually came before the first revelation of God. He talks about everything that was made. And through that, every man is to look at that and to consider. And when man truly considers with an open heart, he will clearly see and he will understand God's attributes, even though they're invisible. He will understand God's power, which goes beyond human comprehension because it is eternal. He will start to clearly understand the divine nature of God. And so this morning, I want to consider a few parts of what God has created and ask the question, as we look at this evidence, as we consider, which of these answers, which of these theories makes more sense as we consider the bat? The bat probably isn't the most favorite of animals, of creatures, most people. But what do we know about the bat? Well, one thing we know is that they sleep during the day and they move during the night. Their life is at night. And so what do they? They fly in the dark. They fly at night. Most of them are found in caves, dark caves. There probably isn't someone here in this room that hasn't taken some cave tour, right? And you got to a certain point and your tour guide then turned off his flashlight, had you turn off your flashlight just to give you a sense how dark it gets in that cave. And how dark does it get? Well, you can put your hand in front of your face and you can't see your hand. That's dark. That's pitch dark. And yet bats fly in that darkness. Not only that, they can fly in that darkness as fast as 40 miles per hour. Now you take your car, you get it up to 40 miles an hour and run into a pole, a tree, a house. You're going to do some damage to the house, the pole, the tree, your car, and most importantly, yourself, aren't you? Imagine a bat flying at, let's just say, 30 miles an hour, not the top speed. in the pitch black dark. If it runs into something, it's going to injure itself, maybe even kill itself. And yet they can do all this in the pitch black darkness. We use that phrase, blind as a bat. Well, bats actually can see. They have eyes and they can see. But what we mean by that, and that cliche comes out, because they use their ears to move more than they do their eyes. They use not sight, but sound in what is called echolocation. It's like sonar in a ship or a submarine or, I don't know, maybe a plane. And what that does is they send out this sound, and this sound bounces off the walls of the cave or wherever they're at, and it comes back to them, and their brain can register, hey, I'm getting too close. The sound waves tell me that. I've got to go, instead of right, I got to go left. Or I got to fly straight. Or I got to go down. Or I got to go, and it happens quicker than that. All by sound. In the pitch black darkness. The largest bat is known as the brown bat. Here's a picture of it compared to a seagull and the wingspan. Quite impressive. Quite a large animal. But everything I said in the previous slide applies to this particular bat as well. How do bats feed themselves? Well, they fly. And as they fly, they eat insects. They capture insects, in which they find in the dark. Again, not by sight, but by hearing. By that echolocation. And I don't want you to get the idea that they just, blindly stumble upon some flying insect and, oh, good, I got it. A bat can eat and catch up to 600 mosquitoes in 1 hour. Aha, bats aren't so bad now, are they? I like to have 1 or 2 around my house in the summer. I'm a little tired of those mosquitoes. 600 mosquitoes using their ears, using echolocation. This is a common picture. Bats don't usually end up by themselves. They live in groups. In fact, those groups are called colonies. Bats live in a colony. There's usually about 100 bats in a colony. And so when you go and see a bat, and maybe you've been into a zoo or something like that, you see a whole bunch of them together. Some colonies have even more bats. Now you put all that together, and isn't it amazing? So close in a pitch dark cave, and yet they never run into each other. Using their ears, not their eyes. Here they are out in the dusk. Again, hundreds of bats flying close proximity, never hitting one another. So I want to ask you, have people really considered this evidence? How did bats survive before they fully evolved this complex system of hearing and moving? Why do we have bats today? How can that system just evolve over hundreds and thousands of years? It can't. It all has to be there. I mean, we haven't even talked about the complexity of the science involved in what the ear has to do and capture to send to the brain, and then the brain having to do with the wings and the body and all that has to happen. But I think you can see, without getting into all the complex science of that echolocation and how it makes that bat move and catch food and all of that, if one part of that system isn't there, isn't fully functional, that bat's dead. It can't survive. So which of these theories makes the most sense considering the bat? In fact, one of them doesn't make any sense. You just scratch your head. How would that happen? But that's the blind faith of evolution. There's some questions we don't ask. We just accept it because we see it. So how many people have really considered the bat? God's people rebelled against him because they didn't consider the evidence that was before them. Let's talk about this interesting sea creature. Looks like a horse, but it lives in the oceans and in the seas. Of course, it's called a seahorse. The seahorse lives among the fish, but is very different than the fish. Where fish kind of swim horizontally, the seahorse lives upright and swims or moves not in the same fashion, but just kind of float in the water. And yet a seahorse, when it needs to, it can go up. When it needs to, it goes down. But it doesn't have gills or fins like a fish. So how does a seahorse not only move, how does it survive? It's able to move up and down when it needs to by controlling the amount of gas in his bladder. So, in other words, you can, again, almost like a submarine, when it needs to go down, it'll take in more gas. It'll take in the right amount of gas, making it heavier, and so that seahorse will go down. When it needs to go up or to stop going down, it will release just the right amount of gas so that it either stops falling or starts moving up. That's how a seahorse moves. Through this special, complex, perfectly designed bladder. I mean, it's not just the taking in of this gas, the release of it. It has to know exactly the right amount to release, to hold. And yet the seahorse does it like that. How does a seahorse live today, given an evolutionary model? Without a bladder, it would sink and die. Or it would float to the top and die. You see, like all creatures, seahorses, their survival depends on their ability to move. If they can't move, they can't get to their food source. If they can't move, they can't get to safety. If they can't move, it's just like us. Sometimes we go on calls, medical calls. A person that's been in bed for months. And what's happening? They're in poor health because they haven't been able to move. And so what do we have to do? We have to try to get them up, out of bed, moving. Moving is key to survival. So you've got this perfectly created bladder that makes movement and survival for this seahorse. And again, we haven't talked about all the complexity of the science behind that bladder and everything that has to work. That if there's one component that's missing, you don't have seahorses. Have people considered that? There are 44 species of seahorses in the Earth's seas. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that we can go out to the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of California, and put on our scuba gear? I just pictured Verna with scuba gear on. And find seahorses in the Pacific Ocean near California? The answer to that is yes, but you have to go to the right place. Seahorses are found in the Pacific Ocean from San Diego, the area off San Diego. That's the northern region. And then they are found all the way down to South America to the nation of Peru. And that seems to be the area of habitat that they're most suited for. And so those would be the closest seahorses in existence to us. But you know, there's something else interesting about seahorses. And I don't know, I think the ladies will like this. Seahorses are the only creature in existence that we know of where the males deliver the babies. Wouldn't that be wonderful, ladies? And I know what you're thinking. Human males would never be able to get through it. But that's what happens. The female deposits the eggs into like a kangaroo pouch, and the male is actually able to fertilize the eggs, and then he gives birth. He basically just puts them out in the water. And a father, the male plays father to the baby seahorses for about 5 to 10 days. Not because he's a bad father, because he's a good, that's all it takes for us, right? We'll get those kids in shape in like 5 to 10 days. And then they're able to actually survive and find their own food source and move about. But it's the only creature where the male delivers the babies, gives birth to the offspring. Why? Was that a genetic defect that came about to be positive? Or is there a certain design in that? How many have considered the seahorse? And to think, again, just in the reproduction of this, if it wasn't all designed, if the female didn't know what to do with the male, and the male didn't know that his place and all that all comes instinctively. It's not taught. There wouldn't be generation after generation of seahorses. Which theory makes the most sense? Which theory is the only one that makes sense? Let's talk about one more, and this is that magnificent, some favorite creature, and that is the giraffe. There's some interesting things about the giraffe. Giraffes stand 10 feet tall, normally, as an average, just at the shoulders. So, if I'm looking at a giraffe at 6 feet tall, just to get to his shoulders, I still need to look another 4 feet up. And then, from its shoulders, the neck, on an average, extends another 8 feet, making giraffes from hoof to horn to head about 18 feet tall. Now, you know, you've been to a zoo. There are ranges of heights, but on an average, most giraffes are around 18 feet tall. But that presents some problems. The heart of the giraffe is here. The brain of the giraffe, out there. What does a brain need from the heart to survive? Blood. How does that blood get up there? I mean, gravity possesses a problem here. That gravity wants to pull that blood down. That's a long ways to go from the heart to the brain. Not so far for us. So you look at the giraffe, and amazingly, what happens? This giraffe decided to photobomb this nice family one day. We find giraffes have an extra large heart. Now, if we have an extra large heart, that's a problem. That's a health defect. But not for a giraffe. And not only that, the heart is about 2 feet long in a normal male. And not only that, the heart generates twice as much blood pressure as a human being or a large animal. And yet his vet is not concerned about his high blood pressure. It's normal. And so he has an extra large heart and extra blood pressure to get that blood up to the brain. That extra 8 feet. How did that happen? Was it just a mutation that happened all of a sudden? No. How does that happen given thousands and hundreds of thousands of years? There's another problem. Giraffes don't always hold their head up. Sometimes they get a drink of water. Now we got another problem. Now all that high blood pressure that was pumping blood up here, now it's gravity is helping. And what? Well, a giraffe, as it lowers its head, whether for drinking, food, whatever would be the purpose, now is in danger of the high blood pressure being a problem. Blowing out their eyes or their brain. Probably more likely to have something like we would call stroke. But here's a giraffe having a drink of water. Doesn't seem to be a problem. What happened? Well, another amazing thing about this creature, they have blood vessels with bypass valves. That's right. They're created with these special bypass blood vessels. And so blood coming down is diverted into these large web of small blood vessels near, of all places, the brain. The place exactly where they need to be. Decreasing the blood pressure. And so these blood vessels near the brain take in the blood, and they know exactly how to lower the blood pressure to the perfect level. And then as the giraffe's head goes back up, they let go. And they let the blood pressure increase as it needs to be. Imagine, it all has to be timed out. Imagine you take a vein that has that crucial blood to you, and you squeeze that. And what happens? That blood's building up, building up, building up, building up. And then you let it go. That's going to have a serious effect on you. It could even kill you. But these blood vessels regulate it all perfect in pressure, perfect in timing. So a giraffe can hold its head up high or can take its head down low and never have to worry about the amount of blood that gets to the brain. Giraffes have this mechanism that constantly monitors the pressure in these blood vessels. And they make whatever adjustments are needed to flow the blood in all of these situations. Which of these theories makes more sense? Now that we can view and see and know the existence of these giraffes and how all this complexity works. We haven't even again got into the science of all of it. But without the specifically designed mechanisms, giraffes would not be able to survive. Who is considered the giraffe? You see, most people aren't hostile towards God today. They're not hostile to the idea of creation and God and intelligent designer. People are apathetic. Just don't care. Because they haven't taken the time to consider. These are just 3 of God's amazing, complex design creatures. That if all that complexity isn't there at the beginning, it doesn't survive. It doesn't live. It doesn't flourish. It doesn't do anything. But you know what we did this morning? You might think it was a great idea. I hope you did. I stole it from Brent Lewis. Made it my own, but he did most of the research here. But he got it from God. Go, if you would, to Job chapter 38. The book of Job chapter 38. That's all we've been doing. We did exactly what God did to Job and his friends. Remember at the end of the book, God is, to say it mildly, is upset. Because Job and especially his friends have been speaking in ways they do not really have knowledge. And so, beginning in verse 38, God basically says, who do you think you are? Were you there when I created the world? Were you there when I set up the sky and the heavens? And so in chapter 38, he asks them this question, can you? And then starts talking about all the things that he's done. Verse 8, can you enclose the sea with doors? When bursting forth, it went forth from the womb. When I made a cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band. And I placed boundaries on it, and set a bolt and doors. And I said, thus far you shall come, but no further. And here shall your proud waves stop. In chapter 39, he says, do you know how to do this? Do you know about this? God does. And notice he starts mentioning these animals. He wants Job and his friends to consider these animals. You have in chapter 39, verse 1, the mountain goats. You have the deer. Verse 5, the wild donkey. Verse 9, the wild ox. You have verse 13, the ostrich. Verse 19, the horse. You have verse 26, the hawk. 27, the eagle. You have God telling them, consider these things. For I am God, and you are not. Here's the evidence of what makes me God. You see, a lot of people aren't serving God, aren't believing in God. A lot of people aren't coming to Jesus Christ to become his child because they really haven't considered, honestly, truthfully considered the evidence. Think about how many animals we could look at. It shouldn't leave you with any doubt that everything that we came about clearly shows us and helps us to understand the goodness, the power, the almightiness of God. There's one here this morning that needs to come and to look at the evidence, not just of creation, but of God's Word. We want to sit down, we want to study with you, but maybe it was the one that's ready to come to that great God, that great Creator, and let him create in you the heart and life of one of his saved children. If we can help you do that this morning, won't you let that be known as together we stand and as we sing.